this next session of our Flannery O'Connor book club, Brad Gooch's amazing biography, Flannery a Life. And we're this is our third meeting about this book. So we've been making our way through it slowly. A few announcements. It's a really exciting time. If you happen to be a fan of Flannery, we're celebrating her centennial next week. So the 25th would be her birthday. We'll be celebrating in fine style here in Milledgeville with a week of festivities. We'll put some links if you happen to be nearby. Birthday cake, free tours, grand or sort of art opening, discovered art, visual art of Flannery, and a talk by Bob Donahue, a screening of Wildcat, a music festival with Colin Cutler. The list goes on. It's a big week. So we'll put some links in the chat there if you happen to be nearby. None of these are Zoom events, alas, or yay.
Yay! Show
Not
up.
sure which one. Yeah. But so without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Bruce Gentry, who will lead us in our discussion.
Okay. Um, well, let's start with a question. Is there anything about the last third of this book that anybody particularly wants to bring up and make a comment about or ask a question about?
I'll
Now,
jump in there.
jump in there, Stephanie.
All right. So Paul Opperman, who is my beloved father-in-law and is also on this call and is also downstairs right now. He and I were chatting today about the last part of this book and talking about the level of strength that Flannery had to have to try to push herself and to stay resilient through like this last kind of stretch of her time. And I felt like I had always known that to some extent and that shows up in things like the film and in a couple of places, but to combine that with the travel that she was doing at the time, whether that was for interviews and people who were like finally getting interested like in her work or starting to see like a scope or a pattern to her work over time, and then also like this trip to Italy, which I knew nothing about. Like that was all brand new news to me. I was really moved by kind of the just the sense of physical exertion that she was going through to try to get her work done and how well Gooch captures that. And so I would bring that up as one of the starting places for this final section, right? Still going to see friends, still giving lectures, still doing interviews, still like traveling with Regina at, cousin Katie's expense. Like I just the whole thing I was really kind of blown away by.
Yeah. She um she wanted to, she needed to, she kind of had to take on these trips. And I think if you when you go through the letters and you read about all these trips for whatever purpose, she does a fair amount of complaining about how wearing it is, but she keeps going. I mean, I made a note to myself, one time to get to Chicago, or was it Notre Dame, she took a 9-hour bus ride across Indiana. And I thought, gee, that's more than I would ever want to do. I used to live in Indiana, and the idea of riding a bus across it doesn't um, doesn't thrill me. And it sapped our strength, you know. Um, I don't think it, I don't necessarily think it shortened her life, but it was something of a distraction. I was struck by um, what's the bit about the limb she'll enter first, and Caroline Gordon says, your fiction isn't as good as it used to be because you've been writing too many essays. You've been writing other stuff so much that it's starting to um, hurt your prose. And I guess Flannery took that seriously and said, you know, maybe so. And yeah, I think that's a generalization we can make. Those final years weren't easy. And she's working hard and she's sick a lot. And there's there's plenty of trouble. And you have to feel for her. I mean, Flannery O'Connor is never somebody who asks for pity, but you could. But uh, oh, one wishes she had better health and more energy, and those final um, projects that she took on could have gone a little more easily.
Yeah. Well, and
The Brad
also the
says,
idea that when she was doing this travel, or even when she was like in the hospital, just like how much inspiration she was still finding by people watching. I thought that was really good too, right? Like she's just a sponge for kind of soaking in what she sees around her and then being able to turn that into stories. And I thought Gooch did a nice job of giving some specific examples of that.
yeah, and I think her mind is on her difficulties all the time, but she holds most of it in. I mean, and everybody who I've ever heard talk about talking to Flannery says, "Oh, I didn't know she was sick." That you'll hear that a lot. That she she would she'd tell the truth about what's going on with her, but only after she got to know somebody pretty well, because she didn't want the lupus to be the one thing that somebody remembered about her. The uh, I I think I heard somebody say that Emery has Regina Klein O'Connor's diary written while she was on the trip to Europe. Um, and I don't know any details about that. That would be something nice to see. It would be something nice to publish. We published a few years ago a diary written by some other people who were on the trip um, to Europe with Flannery. Of course, Flannery skipped Ireland. The most anti-Ireland Irish person you'll ever want to meet um, is Flannery O'Connor. And sometimes the explanation is, well, she needed to make the trip less wearing, but I still think it's somehow significant that Ireland is the one place she said, I can skip that. That Irish heritage is something she always wanted to cover up. And Brad's the one who made me realize how much writer's block Flannery had at the end, trying to write Why Did the Heathen Rage and writing essays and doing self-promotion, um, made her kind of not write anything new or finish anything new in 1962 or 1963. And then she finally, broke out of it a little bit so that she could write three really good short stories in the year she's dying. Um, and, she just makes the joke about, oh, they told me I couldn't work, but I asked if I could write some fiction, and they said, oh yeah, that's not work. You can do that. And the manuscripts of Parker's back that you can see in the Georgia College Special Collections section show how, hi Heidi, show how her handwriting gets difficult. Not that it's hard to read, it's just that you can tell it's an effort for her to make those revisions. So there are all these marginal comments. She's rewriting that final story, and it can't be easy. And she's polishing jokes largely with the final energy, and it's moving. And I would add to that, and and let's make this a tribute to Flannery, that in a way her final stories are about, can be seen as being about, um, how she wanted to accomplish more than she knew she was going to accomplish. You know, Parker's Back is probably the great example. The man tries to transform himself into an artwork to impress his wife, and it doesn't work. She rejects him, beats him with a broom, at the end of the story after he reveals his life's work to her. Judgment Day could be read as Flannery seeing herself as being judged and found wanting. Even Revelation, which in a lot of ways seems like a story with a happy ending, implies that it's not easy to fix somebody like Mrs. Turpin, who is a version of Flannery. And yeah, you give her two spectacular recognition scenes in the course of that story, and yet the um, the story kind of implies the work's not done. Somebody's going to have to come hit her upside the head again in a few months because people like Mrs. Turpin, people like Flannery O'Connor don't quite learn all the lessons they need to learn. Certainly not easily. So that at the end of her life, there's a struggle, and there are reasons to honor her for trying so hard. I don't think she expected to die, but she sure did feel sick. And, at some point, I think Flannery was pretty good at figuring out what her medical state was. And she probably knew that this, that this was all coming at her at the end. So we started with her death. Got that out of the way. My memory of the first biography of Flannery O'Connor by Gene Cash um, is that it has a different kind of a structure, that Jane followed chronology up to a certain point, and unlike Brad's book, which just keeps going on chronologically, Jane just kind of said, "Okay, enough with telling the story of her life. Let's organize the rest of this book, or a big chunk of this book, around the people who are important to Flannery. Let's just take them one by one and not worry too much about how many friendships she was juggling on Tuesday afternoon. Although I still think there's work to be done like that. Someday we're going to figure out how many letters to how many people did Flannery O'Connor write on a given afternoon. Once we put all these collections of letters together, what are we going to find? And let me mention in that regard, we're publishing an article from the September 24 conference about the archive at Texas and more stuff that's there that not everybody knew about. And I am talking to a fellow in Eatonton who knows a man in Eatonton who inherited his mother's box of letters to and from Flannery O'Connor. And this is going to keep happening, just as happened at the Klein house. You go up in the attic and you find stuff. And the next thing you know, the New York Times is in town, right? Everybody should look at the New York Times article that's just being unveiled. We're all real pleased with how they covered it in spite of the factual errors we are going to correct any minute now. Okay, so what did I just say? I said, okay, let's talk about people who matter to her, okay, who come up in the late years. Flannery O'Connor has this network that's very valuable. It's her intellectual life, it's her community outside of Milledgeville, which may be in some ways more important to her than the community in Milledgeville. And you've got all these interesting choices. You've got Flannery being really good friends with people you might not expect her to be friends with. If you think of if you think of Flannery O'Connor as um, strict, unyielding, if you agree with what Brad says at one point that she's basically anti-sex, you might have trouble explaining, well, then why in the world did she make friends with this person or this person or this person? Um, when I went to the 2 o'clock book club this afternoon, we spent a big chunk of time talking about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Um, and I didn't particularly have him highlighted in my notes to talk about, but if our theme for a few minutes is the strange friendship, the surprising friendships of Flannery O'Connor, you can start with him. The Catholic Church said, don't publish your books in your lifetime. We don't approve of what you're saying. And, after he died and his books were being published, Flannery obediently wrote letters asking for permission to read his books. And as far as I can see, was always interested in Teilhard and always liked him. And the phrase, everything that rises must converge, which she put on one of her important stories, but then put on the book that was going to be her last chance to control her publications. She knew it was going to be published after her death. She takes a phrase from Teilhard and sticks it on the title of that book, too. I take this very seriously. She really liked this person who was on the bad list, who was being told suppress it, at least during your lifetime. When the American Scholar asked Flannery O'Connor what's the best book of the 20th century, she didn't pick a novel. She picked The Phenomenon of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And that's not the book that has the phrase everything that rises must converge in it, but it's his most famous book, and she liked it too. Okay, what did Teilhard say that was so terrible, that was so problematic, that it got him in trouble with the church? Now, if you've been reading Teilhard lately, feel free to correct me, but my explanation for this, which I've used for years in the classroom, is as follows. Teilhard believes that everything is evolving and is going to continue to evolve until the end of time. People are evolving. Everything on the planet is evolving. God's evolving. And the happy end that we're all headed towards in the universe is that everything converges. And that includes this evolved, changed God converging with all people. Everybody becomes God, God becomes everybody. And I think there are a couple of points there that the Catholic Church might say that's a little inconsistent with some dogma. Flannery didn't reject him over that. What else might be problematic? One of Teilhard's ideas is that everything that happens is part of that grand plan to get us to the omega point, to this final convergence, where everything's going to be okay and the universe has a happy ending. And you can quickly see that could be a little troublesome. Everything is necessary, and it's okay because it's part of this grand scheme. Slavery? The Holocaust? You're going to say, oh, don't worry about those things. They're part of this wild ride we're on, and it's all going to be okay eventually, after it all falls into place later on. So I think he was sometimes seen as not serious about the horrors we make for ourselves or something like that. Okay. Now, the other thing to think about with Teilhard is that the stories don't clearly illustrate his ideas, right? It's nothing straightforward. You get, I mean, take the story, everything that rises must converge. Is there any convergence? When the black lady on the bus hits the white lady on the bus with her handbag and probably kills her, I don't think that that's most people's notion of racial convergence. It seems kind of like the opposite, saying, we're not ready to make up and all be okay with each other. Um, I could almost accept the notion that there's a kind of convergence at the end of the story between mother and son when Julian is saying, darling, sweetheart, wait, and, calling to his mama that something's happening to him and he's closer to his mother than he's been at any point in the story. That could kind of be a convergence, but it's just on his side. There's that line at the end of that story about Julian's mother looking him in the face and seeing nothing. Like she don't know who this guy is and she don't care about him. So that showing Flannery O'Connor saying, "Oh, I've got to illustrate the theories of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and show that everybody learns to get along and converge with each other." No, I think if Flannery had to say, how could you put that title on a story like that, she would say, well, the kind of convergence that Teilhard is talking about is for the the entire course of world history, the universe. It's way, 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 way off. And that doesn't mean that what we make of our lives is anything comfortable and easy and problems are easily solved. What she wants is the juxtaposition of how the divine eternal plan does not match up with how people treat each other now. It doesn't bother me that she puts that title on that story, and I've never seen her as rejecting Teilhard. Every once in a while, I get a hint that some scholar thinks that Flannery outgrew Teilhard, but it seems to me that she was talking about to Robert Giroux about, I want to call this book Everything That Rises Must Converge, and that's right at the end of her life. I mean, it seems to me she's saying, I want people to know I like this guy. I want his banned books to be read by people and puzzled over by people. And that doesn't seem like a way to reject the guy's ideas. Okay, so here you have the most orthodox Catholic writer of the 20th century choosing to read books that are disapproved of by the church. Potentially an odd choice on Flannery's part. Next up, Marriott Lee. And if you already know everything about Marriott Lee, forgive me for reviewing it for a moment. Bisexual lesbian playwright from New York City who used to go through the streets of Harlem and say things like, okay, I'm going to go into this apartment house and I'm going to go up to the fifth floor and pick the third apartment I see there, and I'm going to talk them into letting me do a play about their life. And I'm sure she was told no often, but that was her method through a big chunk of her career. And when she got through with Harlem, she decided to go to West Virginia and do the same thing. because Harlem and West Virginia are so much alike that, what works in one place should work in another place. Totally different method, genre, you name it, from what Flannery's doing. Go figure. And they became friends. Okay, they were forced into each other's presence. Sure, they're Charlotte Exel. Forced into each other's presence. The star of the New York Times article, everybody should notice that you see her here in a box. Okay, we're getting back to business now. We're talking about Marriott Lee, and we will get to Betty Hester in a moment.
Sounds good.
Okay, and I will call on you then. Okay. Um, Marriott Lee was forced into Flannery's presence because she was the sister of um, Robert E. Lee, the president of Georgia State College for Women. Okay, all that requires is that they might run into each other at a tea party at the governor's mansion or something and say hello to each other and shake hands and say goodbye, see you in the next lifetime. But no, they became friends. Marriott stayed over at the farm and painted in the house, apparently while Flannery was also painting. And they have this long, weird correspondence that they got into where Marriott Lee plays this exaggerated New York liberal, and Flannery plays really retrograde redneck. And they talk about race, and it's a game. I hope. I hope it's like 90% a game, and that it's less serious than it looks like sometimes when you're working your way through all of those letters. They both got something out of it. And in my list of where Marriott Lee shows up in Flannery O'Connor's fiction, I'm up to 5 works. Okay, that she is to some extent, not totally, she is Asbury in the Enduring Chill, even though, of course, Asbury is also Flannery. That's part of what Flannery does, is she mixes her life with her opposite friend's life and puts both of them in a character. But, struggling artist from New York City, who is that? That's more Marriott than it is Flannery. Okay. Julian and Everything That Rises Must Converge, they agreed that was what was going on, that she was turning Marriott into Julian because Marriott told her a story about getting on a bus and deciding to make a point for civil rights and sitting down by a black person who then got up and moved to the back of the bus. Didn't want this white woman sitting beside her. Mary Grace in Revelation is Marriott Lee. And, Northern educated, bookish type who has difficulty with her mother. Yeah, that's got something to do with Flannery, but it's totally Marriott Lee. And we published an article a few years ago. Marriott Lee painted a portrait of her mother, whose name was Grace. And Marriott Lee's mother is probably the pleasant lady in the story who, says sweet things that twist the knife in her child's gut all the way through the scene in the doctor's waiting room. Okay, that's kind of Regina and Flannery, but it's also kind of Marriott Lee and Grace Lee. Where did I get this? I think maybe Brad says this, that to some extent Marriott Lee is like Ray Burt in The Violent Buried Away. That takes more work on my part to see that one, but hey, maybe we keep finding all these connections between O'Connor's late fiction and Marriott Lee. Maybe that makes sense too. Maybe that's how she tried to make Ray Burt more believable, less unlikable, using something she knew from from Marriott as she revised and revised and revised the middle section of the Valiant Bear It Away. And then there's Why Did the Heathen Rage? And I think I have no trouble believing that Una Gibbs in that manuscript is Marriott, a woman who lives in the Northeast who falls in love because of correspondence. And there's this little problem. She thinks she's in love with the black man because of what, um, the main character of that novel has told her. He sent her a photograph of a black guy who works on the farm and said, "This is me." And so the whole world's going to blow up when she drives her little red convertible down to the farm in the South and is ready to meet everybody. Um, the racial element there relates to what's going on, this banter for lots and lots of letters between Marriott and Flannery. So Flannery made the most of this forced friendship with Marriott Lee and ran with it. And, I guess I have to conclude that somehow it was more productive for her fiction that she was thinking about somebody who was her opposite. That her difference from Marriott Lee was more helpful to writing fiction than her similarity to writing fiction. Okay, that's the end of that. That's the end of that paragraph. Okay, now there's the question of Betty Hester. Okay, now I'm going to call on Charlotte Axel. How much evidence are you finding that Betty Hester ever appears in Flannery O'Connor's fiction, because you have said you're on a quest to find it? You're mute. Unmute yourself and answer the question, Charlotte.
Okay, I'm unmuted, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I don't know. I can't say that like she appears as a character in the fiction. Like I'm not sure that that's a thing. If somebody else thinks that they see that, I would love to hear about it. But I feel like for me, I'm kind of more interested in like what Betty Hester's influence on like Flannery O'Connor's writing was more generally. Because I feel like she takes Betty Hester's advice pretty often or gets like really mad about it. And I think that's like I feel like she has some friends where she takes their advice and is always good with it, and then there's some she wouldn't take a lot of Marriott Lee. Like they're very similar or very different. So I feel like I don't know. That's more what I'm looking for. And I feel like I think was it A View of the Woods, where Betty Hester made her change some things. So yeah, lots of examples of in the letters of Betty Hester saying, well, I mean, we don't have letters from Hester, but we can tell that she's saying something about a story and that Flannery seems to be agreeing with her. And I just think that's really interesting. I'm kind of trying to circle back to my honors option that I did and try to figure out, now that I've read all the letters, do I see it more? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is yet, but yeah.
Okay. All the questions remain open. Yeah. So I would say that Betty Hester and Flannery O'Connor had more like a typical relationship between a reader and an author. Betty Hester asks questions and Flannery thinks about it, and sometimes she makes a change to how she's writing it. But she didn't put Betty Hester's life into the stories. Maybe because she was too similar to Betty Hester. I mean, I don't know. There wasn't enough, maybe there wasn't enough friction. I'm so glad that Flannery O'Connor met Betty Hester, because it seems to me it's obvious that Betty Hester would ask anything and she would put Flannery on the spot. She would say things like, well, don't you think the Catholic Church is fascist? And Flannery would go into shock for a while, and then she would think about it.
Yeah.
And she's going to come around to defending the church, but she's not cheating. She's really taking seriously this friendship and thinking things through. She doesn't just dismiss her and say, "Go away. You're giving me a hard time, and I don't need that." Now she decided that Betty Hester had the right to ask her these questions. I imagine Flannery O'Connor had correspondence with a bunch of people she was really good friends with, and they never argued. And uh, they're just not as important to her as these, you know, tortured, slightly difficult relationships. I mean, maybe everybody has to have a relationship that's kind of like Flannery's relationship to her mother to be of any use. She writes about her mother over and over and over and over and over and everything she writes. And so she looks at her friends and say, well, how can I treat you like my mother? Am I going to kill you off? Am I going to humiliate you? Am I going to, how can I use you? And it won't be pretty. Maybe that's just um, how Flannery's mind works.
Yeah, I mean, I
Oh,
think, oh, sorry, can I say something?
yes.
I also think like with Betty Hester specifically, I think Flannery thought that if she made fun of Betty at all in the stories, that that would really upset Betty Hester because she was like not, I mean, I don't know. I don't know her. I wish that I did, but I don't like she doesn't seem like the most like stable person in terms of like mental oscillations. I don't know that I would call it illness, although I mean she eventually committed suicide, but like I think Flannery O'Connor was like, I'm not gonna turn you into one of my characters, not because I think you couldn't handle it, but because you shouldn't have to, kind of a thing. That's my personal take on it.
Yeah. So that Flannery was being nice.
Yeah.
I know lots of writers, uh, causing difficulty to a friend would not stop them for 1 second. Yeah. Steal anything from anybody. I think Joyce Carol Oates would use anything she knew about anybody in the world, bless her. I mean, really, I think it's great that
I,
sometimes you just say everything is available to you if what you're doing is fiction. But she didn't do that with Betty. Well, and that's
I'd
why
like to I'd
Life
like
of
to add
Flannery
one.
called her A. Yeah,
Wait, I gotta put my hand
go
up.
ahead
No,
and
no,
write it.
go,
Oh,
Paul.
I think also she had a sense of a spiritual mentor, a spiritual care because of Betty becoming Catholic, and that she felt a sense of mentorship, guidance, and also camaraderie in sharing that particular kind of spiritual journey. And I think that would make her nicer, but it was a nice that I think came from a deep respect of the shared spiritual journey.
Yeah, I think that's
I was going to say something similar. So in the New York Times article, it was so interesting because if you look on the phone version, he has links. And so he links Ralph Woods. He mentions a letter, Betty Hester, he links to Ralph Wood's essay about Betty Hester in The Political Companion. And then you get this 50 quote from a 1956 letter. And O'Connor calls herself Betty Hester's sponsor. She says, I'm your sponsor. So that's a different responsibility, right? She feels like she's sponsoring her spiritually, I guess. Is that what it is? She says, it would be impossible for me to let you disappear. You have done me nothing but good. You have given me the present you wanted to, but the fact is, above and beyond this, that I have a spiritual relationship to you. I am your sponsor, self-appointed from the time you first wrote me and appointed by you afterwards. It goes on and on. So
I can
that's an
explain
interesting
that.
word. Yeah.
It's that's a particular role in the Catholic Church. We're, and we're all familiar. If you're baptized as a baby, you have godparents. But if you join the church as an adult, the person who stands in for you in the sense of that kind of a guide, or I'm taking that responsibility like a godparent, is called your sponsor. So she was Betty Hester's confirmation sponsor, and it did establish a special formal relationship, I guess, in the eyes of the church. Uh, but it was a very real friendship with that structure, for Flannery.
And even after Betty Hester left the church, it didn't really change how Flannery treated her. I mean, she didn't say, "Oh, now I get to turn you into Manly Pointer," the way she did with Eric Langer. No, she was still very nice towards Betty, as far as I can see. Yes, Charlotte.
I think it's strange too, like, because she was Betty's sponsor, and I think Betty did get to confirmation. Like, I think she did the whole thing, because as an adult, you kind of do it all at once. But it's odd to me that Flannery didn't go to the ceremony, or that Betty didn't try to have it in Milledgeville, because you typically, like, your sponsor is at your baptism, communion, confirmation, and they're so close. And I just wanted to point that out, because I just think it's so weird. Flannery's like, yeah, well, I can't be there, but I will be in spirit. And I'm like, but why? Like, you can have a ceremony anywhere in the diocese. Like,
She was really a lousy sponsor. Okay.
the
That's all
conclusion.
ceremony that everybody expects of a sponsor. Okay. Well, we're going to learn more about this relationship somehow, because there have to be people who remembered who remember things about Betty Hester's later years. And I'm sorry, I have to get off track now and say, in case you don't know about it, that one of the big surprises, what in recent years of O'Connor studies, is that poor Bill Sessions, who worked for years on the authorized biography of Flannery O'Connor, was the literary executor for Betty Hester. And he had legal responsibility for all these letters he couldn't read for years. And after he had spent years working on the authorized biography of O'Connor, he finally got to read all the letters. And he found that Betty and Flannery were making fun of him, criticizing him constantly. And Sally Fitzgerald and Regina agreed that, well, we can't print this stuff in the Habit of Being, in the big authoritative collection of letters. And I remember being at some event, some gathering, and Bill Sessions was in the room, and Brad Gooch was in the room, and he had just seen those letters and seen how they were making fun of him. And he said, well, I don't have to write this book. Brad can write the book. He got over it. He recovered from having his feelings hurt. He got to the point where he could say, he pointed at me and he said, and if Flannery O'Connor knew you, she'd make fun of you too. And I said, well, that's true. She'd probably be much meaner to me than she is to you. She's pretty mean to you. No, I didn't say any of that, but I thought it. And I have the only part of William Sessions's biography that I have seen was the introduction. He used to go hand it out to people, and he starts the book by saying, "Here's the first time I met Flannery O'Connor," and then second half, and here's the letter that Flannery O'Connor wrote to Betty Hester, reporting on this first meeting, and he quotes Flannery saying, "Oh my God, the guy only talks about himself. We thought he would never leave. I mean, he's a really, profoundly silly person. I think Silly Billy was his nickname in a lot of the letters." And it's another very complicated relationship. Here's somebody that apparently she didn't particularly like, but she kept him around. And he made a lot of trips from Atlanta down to Milledgeville to see the O'Connors. And I almost get the impression that his purpose was to give Betty and Flannery small talk. And it wasn't as nice a relationship as Flannery's relationship to Betty. And Uh, one of the weirdest moments in my career here was Bill came down to give a talk at Andalusia about the Betty Hester Flannery O'Connor relationship, and his visual aid, because he was the executor for Betty Hester. Here in my pocket, I have Betty Hester's blood-stained glasses that she was wearing when she committed suicide. And my students came up to me after it was over and said, "Who was this guy that we just listened to? That was the weirdest thing I've ever seen." That's typical response. It's the authorized biographer of Flannery O'Connor who knew her for years, and he's got access to all kinds of stuff nobody has access to, and he's the literary executor for Betty Hester. So yeah, he's kind of the expert on all this stuff, and and he has these little eccentricities that we have to um, forgive if we can. I remember one time Bill apologizing to me for about an hour about talking too much. He just couldn't stop. No wonder he wrote 3,500 pages of biography. There has to be stuff in that biography that we all need to read, and I just don't know how we're ever going to be able to get our hands on it to see what he came up with. And after Sally Fitzgerald and Bill Sessions had so much trouble doing an authorized biography, who is going to be willing to take on that job? Somebody will someday, with absolute cooperation from the recomposed O'Connor estate. But it is a daunting task. Brad Gooch gave a talk one time during the 2014 NEH Summer Institute with Louise Florencourt sitting on the front row, right in front of him. And his thesis was, "Oh, my book is so much better because I didn't have the cooperation of the O'Connor estate. I didn't get into everything. And I had deadlines. I had Little Brown saying, 'You got to finish this book on this date.' And so he just dismissed all sorts of problems that Bill just dove into. He would just look at everything and try to write it up. I remember running into him sometimes and he said, "Oh, I spent the summer writing another 100 pages about Eric. Oh, I spent the summer writing another 100 pages about Marriott Lee. Oh, I wrote another 100 pages about Betty Hester." And I thought, well, the book's supposed to be about Flannery. Isn't that kind of a tangent? If 100 pages, really? But I didn't say it. But then, now I think, well, yeah, we saw the signs coming that this was getting way too complicated for anybody to keep track of. Okay. That's pretty much my list.
While we're on Bill, do you know where his unfinished manuscript is located?
No, I have heard that various people got their hands on it and were trying to cut 3,500 pages down to 800 or something. And well, maybe they did. Maybe Louise Florencourt said, "I don't like it. I don't approve." Maybe that will change now. Everybody go looking. I can't find my calendar. Everybody go looking for, lost documents. See if you run up on Bill Sessions' biography, and let's talk somebody into spending the rest of their life trying to revise the biography. Of course, adding all sorts of information that's being created as we speak at the Klein House and boxes in various attics in central Georgia. The data is just going to keep pouring in. The fire hose is pointed at anybody who wants to take this on. But it could happen. Things have changed so much in recent years that, hey, maybe it's time to try again with, doing a version of, I had had a conversation with my department chair, and she said she would back me up if I could get Bill to just agree that I would do a quick and dirty photocopy edition of the entire manuscript, unedited by anybody. And we just never got around to it, and then he died. And bad on me. I didn't get around to it soon enough because I would have been charmed to have a 3,500 page shaggy baggy version of every fact he could come up with about Flannery O'Connor. I know there are copies out there, that it's not like it's lost, or it's destroyed or anything like that, because the manuscript circulated to various publishers, and they're not all going to throw away the manuscript that they considered. Okay. What else, folks? If you've never seen, I haven't been reading the questions. If somebody wants to tell me uh, what we need to go back to in the chat, I'll listen. If
Funny,
you've never seen Galley, pardon?
yeah, in the chat we
Yeah.
have Heidi says the copy of Cheers, the newsletter to the Flannery O'Connor Society that was next to her bed, next to Louise's bed. No, Flannery's bed? Whose bed?
Betty's bed.
Betty's bed.
Betty's bed.
And then we have Heidi said that Bill asked her to research a tiny detail on Flannery's descendants. Here's his text from 2011. I need some help tracking down these series of facts about the famed geologist Sir Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875. He wrote 2 books, Travels in North America, 1845, and a second visit to the United States, 1849. In one of them, probably the latter, he may have described a visit to Milledgeville, where he may have come into contact with Flannery's great-grandfather, Hugh Trenor. Could you find, and if you copy these references for me, especially that he visited Milledgeville and the work he did there? And then I said, I see why he never finished if he was digging up that kind of stuff. I mean, it's interesting, but it's sort
Thank you.
of, yeah, it's interesting. And you did track him down. I mean, I am interested in a family tree. I think that would be helpful to scholars if we had, like,
Maybe that's what Bill did.
yeah, Trenor is related. I didn't know that. That's a name you hear around
Oh yeah, I live on the man's farm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common name around here. So that would be helpful if we knew that. I mean, I didn't know that. So
So
Sally did a
lots
nice
of work
one.
to be done. It's a big
Yeah.
family.
Where is that? Do you know, Heidi?
I would have to dig up the citation, but I do use it in my paper. I think she wrote it in the mid 80s, something like that. It's not in a very common publication though, so it's hard to find.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, that would be, somebody was asking, the New York Times reporter was asking for a family tree because we were just like telling all these stories. But I'm
Really big piece of
interested
paper.
in
Big
that.
poster.
Yeah, because that would help us. We're doing all this, oral histories. Stephanie's directing that. Charlotte's working on it. Oral histories in the area. And so that would be helpful information, don't you think? These last names that we might, yeah.
And she also does Flannery's dad too, so his side as well.
Yeah, and then the whole
which is
Savannah
not talked about as much, but yeah.
Yeah, I would love to know that because there's probably lots of relatives that knew her in her first 13 years that just stayed down in Savannah and then passed on whatever stories and that aren't really collated in these kind of discussions.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. So yeah, there's plenty more to learn about the family and and all the little tangents that one can go off, run down that path and run down that path. Be careful what you start asking because you may find that the answer is very, very complicated. And I have no idea how to keep a handle on it. I know there's some people who are asking questions. Well, you get a little hint of how complicated things are when you see Carol Schloss's, new double biography of Regina and Flannery. you're going to see there's all this stuff that doesn't really necessarily contradict what Brad says, but it's just, oh, ask some more questions about money and and legalities. And there's just all this additional stuff that you can worry over about the relationships that were uh, complicated and were right there in the main house at Andalusia, that we can kind of ignore as we are reading Brad's biography. So it's it's a well-written book, and thank goodness he finished. And you know, the things that I've heard people pick at in Brad Gooch's book are fairly rare. You know, those pictures in the, you know, from Yaddo that apparently aren't really Flannery. Well, okay, big deal. You can put X's over those two. Those two pictures that isn't actually Flannery. But uh, if he had had access to more documents that he wasn't given access to, he might have made things more complicated. But we see what happened to some other people when they took on all the ways in which Flannery O'Connor's life um, could be complicated. I was reminded from rereading the Gooch biography that the New Yorker uh, received and rejected good country people. I had never realized that, and yes, I did bring it up with the New Yorker writer when he came to town. And his reply was wonderful. He said, "Oh, we have rejected all of great American literature at some point at the New Yorker. The list of great works that we didn't publish just goes on and on and on and on. So, you know, Flannery's in no special she's in no special situation." I ran across the factoid that the rental house that was owned by Flannery, because Regina thought that a woman should have, you know, property and be a landlord, that was a good way to make money. It's on East Montgomery Street on the way to the waterworks. I think Carol Schloss told me she had the street address, and there must be a way to go to the one of those offices in downtown Milledgeville that keeps track of old Milledgeville and find out what's the street address. What did that house look like? Charlotte, you're raising your hand. Do you know this already?
No, I don't know which house it is, but I bet you could find it on the tax assessor records. Because I think Flannery describes the house, and you could kind of try to go off of that, and
Yeah,
then
I'm afraid we're going to find out she was a slumlord, and we're
oh
going to
no.
have to deal with that too. Oh no. I have neglected this particular line of inquiry. You know, forgive me, folks. Um, I was surprised to read that Regina liked everything that rises must converge. We should have mentioned that earlier. And it kind of contradicts the generalization we all make that Regina always fell asleep on the second page of anything she ever read by her daughter. Now, did she realize that she was being killed off in that story? Um, and was Regina okay with that? I mean, did she think, oh, it's more important that she write a good story and it doesn't matter how it reflects on me? Um, I don't know. I've read Carol's biography. I cannot resolve this fact in Brad Gooch's biography and the picture of Regina that I get from the Carol Schloss biography, which is going to come out next year from UGA, unless there are unforeseen delays. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to bring up? I think I'm looking at my notes and saying, okay, the best of the best has come up. And
Well, I have an idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I should preface it with I live in the far north and don't understand the South, and And so when we talk about Flannery's relationship to race, it's it's I'm a foreigner, but I was really intrigued by the discussion of, well, her little and I guess connections with the civil rights movement, and you get the sense that she very much approved of it. Uh, and then Gooch makes, I think, that assessment that given where she lived, her environment, what her life, what makes her life, she could not go, she could not express an activist approach to that movement, and in fact had an ambiguous relationship to it. And I'd be happy to learn more about that. But it may be a subject, maybe it has been talked about a lot. I don't know.
Oh, we're going to talk about it a whole lot more than we have. It's, I mean, I think I'm a Southerner. And I'm fairly mystified by the record on Flannery O'Connor and race. And she says some things that are just so awfully painful about race that it just doesn't seem like the same person. And yeah, yeah, Regina was more racist than Flannery. Okay. But, Lillian Smith wasn't racist. Carson McCullers wasn't that racist. She wasn't particularly racist. Some people think she's quite progressive. And she had models for being a progressive. It doesn't mean she had to go out and fight for it, but she resisted the temptation to be as progressive as she probably could have gotten away with. And it remains a struggle. I mean, I guess I would have to say it's when I think about Flannery O'Connor and race, I think of all my relatives that I grew up with who are very, 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 very racist, and unapologetically so. And I remember lots of family gatherings where after it's over and we're on the way home, my sister and I are both chewing out our parents. How could you put up with that? How could you let them say those things? And nothing happened. We just ignored it. And the next time there was a family gathering, we went back, and I had an uncle who would just start using the N-word as soon as he saw my sister. It would end up in every other sentence because he knew that was how to get her. And that would be how they would start a fight. And I'd sit there and quietly be on my big sister's side, but I didn't tell anybody off. I didn't leave the house. I was, I was as useless as Flannery O'Connor in those situations where you're seeing somebody else do the wrong thing and you just like, I wonder why that person's being such a jerk. And that's just where it's left. And if your family doesn't provide that experience for you of wondering what else could I possibly do? Now, let me say, right now, we are right back in it, aren't we? I get up every day and say, there has to be something I'm supposed to be doing right now. And darn if I can figure out what it is. Everything that occurs to me, I just say, well, that's totally useless. That's not going to change anything. And, every day you turn on the radio, every night we're listening to news late at night, and my wife's losing sleep, and we go have this conversation all the time about what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? You know, the world's on fire. How do we feel like it's reasonable to be spending our time on analyzing literature, much less writing it, when the world's on fire? And so right now, I can say this, I can't feel particularly superior to Anne Flannery O'Connor, who looks at her deeply, deeply racist society and says, well, I just can't fix this. I'll write another story. And she put up with it, and she put up with it, and she put up with it, and she put up with it. And not every writer in the South did. But I don't know. Some people can do things that other people can't do. I don't know. And I try very hard to forgive Flannery and remind myself that I don't seem to have dealt with the issues any better than she did when I was in a sticky situation. So, you know, I can still judge, but I'm probably a hypocrite when I do it. So, oh yeah, there's going to be plenty of, Katie's going to have a really good article about race in O'Connor that's in a book that's forthcoming from UGA Press, and it is called, what's the title of the book, Katie? Remind
The
us.
Blues Haunted South now.
Oh, it's what?
I changed the title. It's The Blues Haunted South.
Blues Haunted.
Driving While Black in A Good Man Is Hard to Find.
Yeah, it's really good. I wish the whole book were going to be that good, and it probably isn't going to be. What's the name of the collection?
Reckoning with Race
Reckoning with Race.
and O'Connor. Yeah, it's at
UGA Press.
Yeah, UGA Press. So, but part of I think the other thing I was thinking about Thaddeus Davis's talk when she came down for the NEH in 2023. And one of the things she started talking about was the quote where O'Connor says, I've never been anything but sick. And that's sort of like puts you in another foreign land. You know, it's a place people don't want to visit much. And so I feel like Thaddeus was sort of creating this scenario where, okay, O'Connor's racist, but she's also marginalized in her society and she has a kind of outsider perspective, even though she's an insider. And that was a kind of interesting standpoint for her to explore. So that's one way. I think this collection that's coming out is going to add considerably. People are doing some really interesting work. A lot of it sort of like unacknowledged influences on O'Connor's work that are, like Black blues tunes by vaudeville Broadway artists, popular culture influence on her, film, radio shows. How did she pick up all that stuff that was sort of Black culture and work with it in her work? Caricatures, her early cartooning is dependent on sort of minstrel kind of humor. And how is she incorporating both racist ideology, making fun of Black people or animals, that kind of thing, like Song of the South, that kind of thing. And how is she also kind of incorporating sort of the blues or art, artistry into, and not acknowledging or even understanding what she's doing. She's a product of a town where there were 20 African American owned music clubs at one time in this little tiny town. So that just tells you there's some influence that we don't know about too well.
Flannery never claimed to be influenced by Black artists, but she was.
Yeah.
And that really complicates it. And I would say I have believed her too much. Okay. So she only thought that white art was worth taking seriously enough to be influenced by it.
Yeah. Or classic works, like she'll acknowledge these classics that she was reading. Of course, those are her acknowledged sources, but she's picking stuff up from advertising, from the movies, lots of places. And I'm going to say she's picking it up from Black music.
And her statement about having a tin ear and paying no attention to music is just a lie. And the
Boxes of
radio's
albums.
in the house and they turned them on.
Yeah, there's radio on her desk in the Klein house. There's 2 boxes of record albums. There's 3 pianos in the house. She has an aunt who gave piano lessons. I mean, I just think she didn't play music herself. She didn't play an instrument, but she knew about music, you know, especially the radio. I mean, and Charlotte did a great oral history with Susan Ketchum, who says, yeah, they're listening to Black music from Atlanta at that point. The radio waves were not controlled. And Macon was this big booming music town as well. So
Yeah, and back in the day, you could pick up radio stations from far, far, far away too. Anything you had a taste for, you could find it on AM radio in the middle of the night. Charlie, you have your hand up, but you're muted.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just want to say, especially like because I've been reading over like the letter that the tin ear quote is in, and it's in a letter to Betty Hester, and I think she really just didn't want Betty Hester to send her a bunch of records. Like, it kind of sounds like now that I put all the context together, it kind of sounds like Betty was like, I have a bunch of them. Do you want these? And I think Flannery wasn't a person who wanted to like collect music. I think she wanted to have what she liked, and that was it.
Good. Okay. All right. Thank you. Anything else, folks?
Heidi puts in here that
Oh, yeah.
she played the accordion
Oh, she played the accordion.
because she thought it would be the most annoying to her mother, and she took piano lessons her whole life. She took them her whole life along with art. So that's okay. If you take piano lessons your whole life, like as an adult, she took them. I don't, from sisters. Wow. I don't, did you guys know that? I didn't know that.
I knew about the accordion. I didn't know she was always taking piano lessons.
That's from
Yeah.
your book, Bruce. That's from
Huh?
your book.
Oh, really? I said
Yeah.
that?
No, from the Conversations book that you.
Oh, well, who reads those books? You mean,
Yeah,
you mean
there's an interview.
At
Yeah,
Home with Flannery O'Connor?
yeah.
I read
There's
all
an
that stuff.
interview
It
from a
reads
sister
long
in
enough
there.
to proofread it. I can
Well,
spell.
Monica Miller asked me yesterday because I was telling her about the Klein house, and she
Yeah.
said, "Is there any sheet music there?" And I said, I don't know. I'll have to look." She goes,
I thought so.
"Look in the piano benches." And I'm like, I didn't look in the piano benches. There's 3 pianos. So I want to go find a good man. It's hard to find in there.
So let's all agree that on March 25th, 26th, if Frances is in town, we're going to tackle her and say, what was in those piano benches? Because she must know, right?
Yeah. Or just we'll
They're
go
all
in.
taking piano lessons. They were all probably taking turns practicing on those.
Yeah, I'd love to see what music she took lessons, if we can find out from who. Was it her aunt that taught the lessons in the Klein house? Right?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. So Flannery had a myth of herself that we can poke holes in.
I don't think it was an aunt. I think, didn't they have a boarder?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they had borders.
Yeah, so they had an older lady boarder, and she offered piano lessons there.
Okay.
I don't think it was Sister Duchess.
Didn't you see an advertisement, Charlotte, for piano lessons in the Milledgeville Union Recorder in 1953 or something like that?
I'd have to go back and look at my pictures from Emory, but I feel like I was gonna say too, like I think she was definitely listening to the radio as source material for a variety of different reasons, music included. I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
It's an Andy.
Anybody-
It's
yeah.
a big show that ran for, 15 years on the radio before it became a television show. And it's just the kind of broad slapstick, racist humor that I think she was enjoying.
Anybody with a case for historical data, okay, go reread every newspaper Flannery O'Connor ever read from Atlanta and Milledgeville.
Mm.
you can spend a long time, and it's so much fun reading microfilm. I mean, that is how you have to read it, right?
Mhm.
Somebody's going to have to do it. I just said, it's not going to be me. Somebody
Yeah,
else.
me either.
My
Believe me.
kind of factoids.
I don't feel like I have to do that to prove that, because I know she read the paper every day. And
Yeah.
so stuff was in the paper, she knew about it. I don't need to find the article, you know.
Yeah, well, I'm right there with you. Yeah.
So
About I don't have to do that.
yeah, I mean,
Somebody else.
in that question where she said it's all the Beatles to me, when she was saying she didn't like to Betty Hester that she had a 10-year. It's all the Beatles to me. Oh, that's somebody who's heard the Beatles, you know. I mean, she's not aware. And then the Beatles were the opening act for Little Richard, who was from Macon.
Right, they were very influenced by.
Did she know that? Because he was working out a sound for 3 years in Milledgeville. Did she know about Little Richard? She isn't going to talk about it much because she's probably denigrating him. You know,
Wouldn't
he's
you just love
performing
it
without a
if
shirt and screaming, you know.
wouldn't you just love it if she could have admitted to be a fan of Little Richard?
Oh, dude, I want to get that. I want
I
to
could
get her.
die.
Yeah,
Just
I want
give
to
me
get her
that.
at the club, the Blue Note around the
The
corner.
secret admirer of Little Richard.
Maybe that's the restricted thing at Emory. It's Flannery's.
Oh, there's still
Centennial,
restricted stuff?
the Little Richard.
Well, don't steal it. We've stopped taping. We've stopped taping now, haven't we? Okay, thank you all for your tolerance. We've been here way past when we're supposed to stop.
Yeah. Well, nice
Much
chat
fun.
with you all.
All right, see
Happy
you next
birthday,
time.
all of you. Thank you for
Yeah,
keeping
thanks
Flannery's
for hanging
birthday
in.
well.
Yeah, happy birthday.